Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping right into what is literally the deepest, most profound mystery of human existence. You know, for as long as people have looked up at the night sky, we've asked questions. We look at the walls of a classroom, the trees outside, the stars above, and we just know each part has a history. Tables were built, buildings were designed. But when we zoom all the way out, a massive question emerges. Where did the universe itself actually come from?
Seriously, take a second to let that massive philosophical puzzle sink in. Why is there something rather than nothing? Today, we're approaching this just like we're sitting in a high school philosophy class. We'll look really closely at the hard scientific evidence, but we aren't going to stop there. We'll also explore how entirely different worldviews interpret the exact same data. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our syllabus for today's intellectual journey. First, a universe with a past. Second, mechanism versus purpose. Third, three philosophical responses. And finally, building a cumulative case. Let's get to it. Part 1. A universe with a past. You know, for a really long time, it was entirely possible for scientists to believe that the universe had just always existed in this steady, unchanging state. But over the last century, the evidence shifted dramatically, and so did the scientific consensus. Cosmologists point to two absolutely crucial pieces of observational evidence here. The first is expansion. Observations show that distant galaxies are actually moving away from one another. Think about it. If the universe is expanding right now, logic dictates that in the past it must have been smaller, hotter, and way more dense. The second piece is the cosmic microwave background, which is basically a faint radiation afterglow filling space. Fun fact, if you've ever seen the static on an old untuned television, a small percentage of that static is literally radiation from the dawn of the universe. Together, these totally prove the universe hasn't just been sitting here forever. And that brings us to the Big Bang Theory. Now, honestly, the name is a bit misleading. It wasn't an explosion of matter into an already empty room, you know, like a bomb going off in a warehouse. Instead, around 13.8 billion years ago, there was this rapid period of inflation. Space itself expanded, and as it expanded, the universe cooled down, which allowed basic matter to form. That matter eventually led to structures like stars, planets, and, well, us. The Big Bang model is incredibly powerful for explaining the early development of the universe. But like all models, even the strongest scientific explanations have boundaries. Take this perspective from NASA, for example. Science beautifully maps out the process, but it eventually hits a wall regarding what caused it all to start. Scientists remain uncertain about what powered cosmic inflation, or if the concept of before even makes sense, especially if time itself is part of the physical universe that's being created. Which perfectly sets up Part 2, mechanism versus purpose. What exactly happens when we reach the absolute limits of scientific explanation? Well, this is where cosmology steps back and philosophy steps forward. Science asks, how does this process work? Philosophy asks, why is there a universe with matter, energy, and laws in the first place? And this brilliantly illustrates the difference between those two questions. Thinker John Lennox uses this amazing analogy of a boiling kettle. If you ask why the kettle is boiling, a scientific explanation describes the heat transfer, the rising temperature, and the movement of water molecules, right? But another entirely valid explanation is that someone simply wanted to make a cup of tea. Both are 100% true. One explains the mechanism, while the other explains the underlying purpose. Let's look at another quick example to hammer this home. Science can perfectly explain the physical process of how a song is recorded on a smartphone, transmitted through data waves, and then played through a friend's speakers. But that perfectly complete physical explanation does absolutely nothing to explain why a person actually chose to send that song to their friend in the first place. They are just two entirely different levels of explanation. To go a bit deeper into the why, philosophers use two vital terms, contingent and necessary. A contingent reality is something that depends on something else. It literally didn't have to exist. A tree is contingent because it depends on soil and sunlight. Your smartphone depends on engineering. A necessary reality, on the other hand, exists by its own nature and doesn't depend on anything outside itself. So the ultimate philosophical question becomes, is the universe itself contingent? The theistic philosophers often argue that since everything inside the universe is dependent, the universe as a whole must be dependent on something beyond it. But critics impartially point out a logical risk here, known as the fallacy of composition. Think about a brick wall. Just because every single brick in a wall is small, it doesn't automatically mean the wall itself is small, right? Therefore, just because every object inside the universe is dependent, critics argue it doesn't automatically follow that the entire universe is dependent. Moving on to Part 3, Evaluating worldviews. Because the scientific evidence leaves the ultimate origin unanswered, different worldviews step in to interpret that data. We're going to impartially map out 3 major ways people respond to this cosmic evidence.
First up is the theistic view, argued by thinkers like Stephen Meyer. They claim the universe points to an intelligent cause outside of space and time. But the limitation? People ask, why must that cause be understood as God? Second, we have the brute fact view. This basically argues the universe simply exists as a basic fact. No deeper explanation needed. The limitation here? Critics ask why it's reasonable to just stop asking questions there. And finally, the future science view. This is the hope that a future scientific theory will eventually explain it all. But the limitation is whether future science can actually explain why existence itself happens, or if it'll just describe even earlier physical conditions.
So, the crucial point is that no worldview is without its assumptions. If we look specifically at the theistic view, proposing a creator is highly debated. Critics rightfully ask some tough questions. Even if there is an explanation beyond the universe, why should it be personal? Why should it be intelligent? Does adding an unobservable God to the equation actually solve the mystery, or does it kind of just create more complex philosophical problems for us to solve? On the flip side, relying purely on natural laws has its own philosophical hurdles. The author C.S. Lewis once warned that we really shouldn't confuse a description of nature with an explanation of reality. He wrote, "A law does not create the things it describes. The law of gravity beautifully explains how objects move, but the law of gravity cannot explain why there is a universe governed by gravity in the first place." This brings us to part 4, building a cumulative case. We have to ask ourselves, how do we actually make sense of all this? If science has boundaries, and every philosophical worldview carries assumptions, how do thoughtful people navigate these massive questions without relying on a single silver bullet?
Philosopher Timothy Keller suggests a really helpful framework here. He calls the beginning of the universe a clue rather than a final proof. Think of it like finding a footprint in the mud. A single footprint doesn't prove exactly who walked by, what their name is, or their whole life story. But it is a clue. It invites investigation. It doesn't force a conclusion, but it strongly suggests someone was there.
And this is exactly how a cumulative case works. You don't make one single argument carry the weight of the entire universe. Instead, you look at several features of reality together. Keller combines the scientific clue of the universe's beginning with other philosophical clues like the apparent mathematical order of nature, human moral awareness, and our profound sense of beauty and longing. A cumulative case asks, do all these puzzle pieces fit more naturally into one worldview than another?
Which leaves us right here, at the end of our explainer, with the ultimate open-ended question. Science tells us the universe has a beginning, but it cannot tell us why. So I leave this to you. Is it reasonable to seek an explanation beyond the universe, or is the universe itself the final explanation? Whatever your answer is, recognize the assumptions you're making to get there. Keep investigating the clues, keep asking the big questions, and thanks so much for joining our class today.